Hey everybody, it's PJ from Wisconsin Air Gunners, and I'm here to talk to you about a topic that should be at the forefront of every airgun shooter's mind, and that is trajectory as it relates to air rifles. Your ability to hit this rabbit at 10 yards or this pigeon at 65 is going to be absolutely rooted in your understanding of what that pellet is doing in flight on the way to the target. So, if you don't have a great understanding of airgun trajectories, this video hopefully is for you. My goal in setting this out is to try to get us all on a level playing field where we understand what's happening to that pellet as it flies through the air. Now there's a lot of, misinformation or misunderstanding out there, and I think a lot of that comes in, one, because we're talking about an actual scientific topic that not a lot of people have taken the time to study, and two, a lot of the information that we have comes from the firearms world. And it's not that what we're going to talk about today is different when we're talking about firearms. It just applies differently because of the speeds involved. So my goal today to help you understand this is to take a fairly simplified view of what's actually a complicated physics sort of process. We're going to leave a couple things off the side. We're not going to worry so much about things that you might have heard, Coriolis effect or spin drift or any of those things. This is really intended to be a basic view of how trajectory works. Also, for most of our conversation, we're going to ignore crosswinds, and we're certainly going to ignore headwinds and tailwinds. That's a topic for maybe a future video, but it's a little bit more advanced than we want to get into today. So first up, slugs. If you've watched any videos about air gunning, if you've read anything about air gunning, you know that a lot of people are really interested in shooting slugs. And if they shoot well out of your gun, it's a good deal. Slugs work differently than pellets, though. A slug is spin or gyroscopically stabilized. It's that spinning motion imparted by the rifling of the barrel that holds that slug true on its way to the target. If you think of it like riding a bicycle at high speed, even though that bike is very narrow and it seems like it should be tippy, actually the faster you go, the easier it is to track straight. Same thing's happening with that slug. It's spinning around its center axis, and as it moves through the air, its center of gravity is actually behind its center of pressure. So as long as it spins, it'll stay going straight and true. Now the advantage that slugs give us as air gunners is that they can be shot farther and they buck the wind a little bit better. And you can see why guys like Keith and Norm from 68 Whiskey are so excited to shoot them. They're shooting, I just saw a video the other day where they were shooting tin cans, soda cans at 300 yards. Something that would be unthinkable with a pellet. So slugs definitely have their place. You just have to decide which of these projectiles is right for you. So a pellet is an entirely different matter and what most of us as air gunners are shooting on a daily basis. They're significantly cheaper, they're available in a lot of different styles and shapes, they've been around much longer, and they shoot well out of almost every air gun. In fact, most guns have a pellet that they can shoot well. But how do they work? So where a slug is spin stabilized, a pellet is drag stabilized. What that means is as the pellet is moving through the air towards the target, air is pulling back on the skirt, and it creates a center of pressure behind the center of mass or center of gravity. And so it doesn't need rifling to stabilize it on its path to the target. If you've ever seen or played badminton, you know how this works. You hit the shuttlecock with your racket, the shuttlecock turns around and flies straight towards where you slammed it. A pellet's basically working in the same way. You fired in one direction, air is holding back on that skirt, and it is stable all the way to the pellet. It's very accurate, it does have limitations. Because it's being stabilized by being pulled back essentially by the air, it has what we call a low ballistic coefficient, meaning it's bleeding off speed and as a result, energy as it moves towards the target. As a result, it's harder to propel a pellet fast enough to get it to go as far as a slug can go. That has some advantages. With a pellet, there's a limit to how far it can go, especially if you're shooting flat and level. With a slug, that may travel a lot farther than you'd think, and it means you have to be, well, not extra sure, because you really need to know where your target is and what's beyond it at all times. But know that a slug is going to fly much farther than a pellet if it misses its target. I've used the term ballistic coefficient, also known as BC, a couple of times. I think it's worth it to just take a brief moment and help you understand a little bit what ballistic coefficient is. Think of ballistic coefficient as the slipperiness that a projectile has as it moves through the air. A higher BC is going to move through the air with less resistance than a projectile with a lower BC. So here's an example of two JSB projectiles, one a slug and one a pellet. You see the difference in the numbers we're talking about. Now don't worry about the absolute numbers. There's some science and math behind how ballistic coefficient is calculated. And there are tables to help you look up, if you can't calculate it yourself, what the ballistic coefficient of whatever projectile you're shooting. If you're going to use any of the apps that calculate trajectory for you, you're going to need to know the ballistic coefficient of your projectile. And the thing you need to know about any of these reported numbers is that they're estimates. Here's why they're estimates. Ballistic coefficient is dependent on velocity. The same pellet moving faster will have a higher ballistic coefficient. And because the velocity of that pellet is ever changing as it flies toward the target, ballistic coefficient is not a constant. I'm going to say that again because it's super important. Ballistic coefficient is not a constant, and it's dependent on the velocity of the projectile. So any BC numbers you have are always estimates. For the purposes of our discussion today, there are two forces that are influencing where that pellet is going to hit when it gets to the target. And the first one is gravity. Gravity is pulling down on that pellet constantly as it moves through the air. Gravity is pulling down on that pellet from the millisecond it leaves the end of the barrel all the way to the target. And that pull is going to be a constant. Doesn't matter how fast the pellet's going. Here's where speed comes in. A slower moving pellet spends more time in the air, and gravity has more of an opportunity to pull down on it. The other force that's at play is the resistance that the air your pellet is moving through creates. So as it goes, it's pushing air molecules out of its way on the way to the target. And how much that is going to scale back its velocity is based on ballistic coefficient, which we've already talked about. Two primary forces influencing that pellet. Again, a simple understanding of it, but two forces. One, gravity pulling it down, and two, wind resistance slowing it down, allowing gravity to do more of its thing. Let's take a look at what two different projectiles would do in the real world if they could be fired. We're talking about the same weight of projectile, the same velocity, fired out of the same gun. So this graphic shows us two different projectiles. Again, effectively the same velocity leaving the barrel, same gun, just tuned differently so that it can achieve the speed we're looking at. Same weight, one a pellet, one a slug. What's going to happen is that the slug is going to hit the target higher than the pellet will. And it's going to hit higher because it has a higher ballistic coefficient, which means it's going to lose less velocity as it moves through the air. It's going to hit the target faster, and gravity is going to have less of an opportunity to pull it down to the earth. The pellet, moving slower as it goes through the air because of its lower ballistic coefficient, is going to spend more time in the air and therefore be more affected by gravity. You have to excuse the geese going by. They've obviously got someplace they need to get to. Up to this point, we've ignored wind. In the real world, shooting, you can't ignore wind, and a huge part of being able to shoot accurately is understanding how the wind impacts your pellets. Again, not the focus of this video, but I am going to put up a couple of stills here from one of Shooter 1721's videos. I'll actually link that video down below, but he managed to capture really in real time a drop off in a crosswind that had a significant and measurable impact on where his pellets were hitting. So here's the first part of his group, and you can see he's actually got the tape from around a tin of pellets hanging off the barrel of his rifle, and you can see in the angle of that piece of tape just exactly how much wind there is and where that group is forming. And then now you should see that tape, it has stabilized, but look where that pellet hits as a result of the drop in wind. So I'm not trying in this video at all to discount the importance of understanding what wind is going to do to your left and right trajectory. And as you get more into it, a wind coming at you will do something different than a wind coming at your tail, but that's more advanced than what we're talking about today. I had this photo up at the beginning of the video without much explanation. What you're seeing here is a trajectory chart, and what I've done is taken my FX Maverick and I have shot it at different distances, leaving my scope set up at a 25-yard zero. I looked at the Strelok chart, which I'll put up here, and you can see where that should be hitting. And what I wanted to do was proof that chart. One, so I knew if the chart was valid and the data was good, and two, to help you understand how to use a tool like Ballistics software. So this is my chart. Each of these strips is a shot at the listed distance. And as you can see, there's this curve, the trajectory. And that's the essence of what this video is about. You see that pellets start by hitting low, then they come up to the 0 point. They actually go above the 0 point, come back to the 0 point, and then start trailing off. And that's this, what we might consider kind of a loopy trajectory that my 22 caliber rifle has. You've probably heard people say, a 177 is very flat shooting. Well, if you look at the world of sub 12 foot-pound air guns, the types of guns that are shot in Great Britain where they have power limits, if you take two rifles, one in 22 sub 12 and one in 177 caliber sub 12, because of the speed limitations, because power is based on speed, because of the speed limitations, you will see that the 177 appears to shoot flatter than the 22. In the US, where I am, you don't have such limitations because you can crank both that 177 and the 22 well above 12 foot-pounds. The rifle that my shot chart that I showed you is tuned to shoot in the mid 30 foot-pounds. So you can sort of accelerate your way out of what the Brits would consider kind of a loopy 22 caliber trajectory if you can increase the velocity and take the rifle above, well, 12 foot-pounds. Listen carefully, despite what those geese are saying, because this is important, maybe the most important thing I can say. The idea of a looped trajectory is false. It's not true. It doesn't work that way. Here is what you as an air gunner need to absolutely understand. Maybe I'll put a little marker so like if you're only going to watch one thing, watch this. The trajectory is not actually on like a parabolic arc. The pellet is not, as many people believe, rising as it comes out of the barrel. What's happening is your barrel is angled ever so slightly up, and your scope is angled ever so slightly down, at least relative to your barrel. That's what gives this appearance of a looped trajectory. Your pellet comes out at whatever angle it's sent out of the barrel at, and immediately starts dropping off. And your scope is aligned at a distance you pick, okay? In the chart I showed you, I picked, it's actually about a 23-yard zero. The alignment of the pellet coming out, taking into account all those things we've talked about, gravity and ballistic coefficient, the pellet is set to intersect with the actual straight line of sight through your scope. It's set to intersect at that point. In my case, at 22, 23 yards, because of that straight line of sight of your scope and the slight upward angle and then drop off of the pellet, it also zeroes at 45 yards. And you can see that both in the Strelok chart and in my shot chart. You'll see it's just about there, 20, 25 yards, and then it's dead on at 45. And that's exactly what Strelok tells me should happen. So, you're setting up your rifle. What should you zero at? The way to figure out what to zero your rifle at is to get the data on your rifle, plug it into software, and then figure out where does this give me the best opportunity to hit most of my targets. Now in my range, I have lots of targets at 45 yards. And so this dual, kind of 22 and 45 yard works really well for me. However, I also have a couple of scopes that have a zero stop, and I really like using that zero stop. So look at this chart at what happens when I switch it to 30 yards for the zero. It keeps everything sort of below the line. So I just dial and then dial right back to zero. And by dialing, I mean I turn the turret to get to the place where my line of sight impacts where I know that pellet's going to be. For my setup, I zero at around 30 yards. And then everything is dialing up. So to get a 10-yard shot, I actually have to dial up, I think it's about 17 clicks or something like that, to make that 10-yard shot. I'm sorry, I think that's a 15-yard shot is 17 clicks. But I have a chart for that, or you can put stickers on your turret if you have exposed turrets. By knowing where my pellet is going to intersect my line of sight at any given distance, it becomes very easy, easier to hit whatever target I want to hit. Now what it requires is knowing exactly what distance any given target is. But if I know that distance, I know I can make an adjustment to the scope to put the crosshairs precisely at that location where my line of sight is going to intersect where that pellet is going to be. And whether that is in the front part of my trajectory as the pellet is rising because the barrel is angled up to meet my line of sight, or where it's falling off and I have to dial the scope to move that crosshair down to where that place in space is going to be, I can make those adjustments and be very accurate in my shooting. It requires that I know the precise velocity my gun is shooting. It requires that I know the ballistic coefficient, and it requires that I either manually, by shooting it and measuring it, or sort of automatically by plugging everything into software and have that do the work for me, and then proofing that software, checking to make sure it actually is reporting out what's happening in the real world. I can make very precise shots at whatever distance I have data for. Well, everybody, that's a lot of information, and I appreciate you sticking around to listen to it. Everything I've said applies to any pellet or slug that you're going to shoot. It actually applies to centerfire. The difference being centerfire bullets move so fast that gravity seems to have less of an impact on them. It's just a function of how much time they're in the air and how fast they're going. And because we're shooting at, compared to bullets, relatively low velocities, that drop in trajectory due to gravity is just more pronounced. We're also shooting projectiles that, even in the case of slugs, have relatively low ballistic coefficients as compared to centerfire bullets. I hope this information has been useful to you. If there are other questions I might be able to answer, please stick those down in the comments below. Appreciate any positive feedback you might have on this video. Feel free to share it with anybody new to the sport. I think it's good information. Hopefully it'll help them get off the ground running. If you want to check out what we're doing sort of on a day-to-day basis, you can check us out either at PJ_Clark or at Wisconsin Airgunners on Instagram. We also have a Facebook page if you want to check that out. I hope this video has been useful to you. If it has, please consider giving me a thumbs up. And as always, if you like the content, please subscribe. Until the next video, folks, shoot safe and shoot straight, and we'll see you around. Thanks for watching.